Is there anything you would have done differently?
We reported a true story.
Our colleague Brian Williams is back in Kuwait City tonight after a close call in the skies over Iraq.
Controversial Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh and questions about Kavanaugh's drinking in the past.
Sean Hannity, come on up, Sean Hannity.
Today, Andrew Cuomo is having a moment.
Well, hello. I'm Chris Narwhal.
And I'm Eliana Johnson.
Welcome to Inkstained Wretches, El Wretchos to our friends, where we break down what's going wrong and what's going right with the American news media. Eliana Johnson, good to be back with you, though remotely, after a week hiatus afforded to us by our friend Jonah Goldberg. It was so great to have Jonah with us and hear all the good feedback from folks, this Marvel crossover that the world apparently had been waiting for.
Yes. And welcome back from, you were in Singapore giving a talk.
I've been in
Welcome back.
I've been in Scotland, I've been in Singapore, I've been in Seoul, and now I'm home. And you know, I know it's corny to say, but golly gosh, do I love the United States of America. I really, really, really love the USA.
Well, we have 2 weeks of content to make up for and discuss. And I saw people commenting last week that after the Trump verdict came down, they were like, okay, some people like Jonah interview where neither one of us could do an episode last week, but they were like, oh man, so much news this week and no show. So we're making up for lost time now. And on our front page, there's a ton of stuff to get through. We have, Chris, I was so amused by this. The Wall Street Journal had a big piece that they said was based on 45 interviews, the headline of which is, "Behind Closed Doors, Biden Shows Signs of Slipping. Participants in meetings said the 81-year-old president performed poorly at times. The White House said Biden is sharp and his critics are playing partisan politics." And I think it probably didn't help that the anecdotes in this piece all come from Republicans. There's one from Kevin McCarthy and another from Mike Johnson. And it didn't really deliver as much as I thought was promised in the headline, or show that they had really done interviews with 45 people. But one amusing aspect of it was they talked to a lot of Democrats for the piece, and it's clear that the White House was monitoring the reporting of this piece as it was going on. And there's a paragraph in it. The White House kept close tabs on some of the Wall Street Journal's interviews with Democratic lawmakers. So they were obviously concerned about what these people were going to say. After the offices of several Democrats shared with the White House either a recording of an interview or details about what was asked, some of those lawmakers spoke to the Journal a second time and once again emphasized Biden's strengths. And then Gregory Meeks, New York congressman, tells the Wall Street Journal, "They just, said that I should give you a call back," said Representative Gregory Meeks, a New York Democrat, referring to the White House. And then the White House says, "We thought it was important that all perspectives be represented." But what I thought was most amusing about this is, okay, sure, maybe this is happening behind closed doors, but it's also happening in front of doors and very much in public. And this Journal piece came out on June 4th, and it came a couple days after Time magazine put out the transcript of an interview that they did with Biden on May 28th, so about a week earlier. And transcript of this interview is, it's pretty incredible. Biden truly makes no sense at times in it. He twice says that Russia invaded Russia. And of course, anyone can misspeak, but there are several other examples of it. I think the most amusing kind of rambling bit comes, and I want to read it and then get your take on all this. He's talking about Dick Lugar and Africa. So let me read this bit. He gets a question about his second-term foreign policy goals, and he's talking about his plans to help Africa build back better.
Nah.
And then he says,
back to what?
yeah. So he says, we on the climate side. So the question is the following. Let me ask you one on the, if you do win in November, Mr. President, with a mandate to continue your approach to foreign policy, what would your goals be in a second term? And he starts talking, and then he says, we on the climate side have come along and we've done everything that is reasonably, and 3 other countries are the reason that we're in the problem we're in. But what happens is all of a sudden on the Amazon, they're starting to clear vast swaths of land, cut down forests, etc. Back when Dick Lugar was alive,
Right.
he and I started something back in the 90s where we said, late 80s, where we said in the Amazon, they said, look, if you will make a deal with you, Brazil, you don't cut down your forest, we'll pay you not to do it. We'll pay you not to do it. We have to prevent, and that's why we're working so hard to make sure Angola can be in a position that they have more solar capacity than almost any place in the world to help the whole continent. That's why we want to build a railroad all the way with others in Europe, all the way across the continent.
What?
It goes on, but
I'm sorry.
it's actually
I'm sorry. We have a plan. We have a plan
Yeah.
to build a transcontinental African railroad.
It's like, but first he's talking about Brazil, and then he's in Angola, and then he says about the railroad, so that you have countries that have overproduction of agriculture and some that don't have it, but no way to get it transferred. There's so much opportunity in Africa, and we have to work it.
The United States is going to build a transcontinental railroad in Africa. Well, color me surprised.
Let me just say that, the journal's anecdotes are less colorful than the transcript of the Time magazine interview that is at times shocking.
Well, if you hear Biden's voice when you listen to or when you read the Time transcript, it tracks, right? Well, he said da da da, and then you can hear the shouting and then the whisper talking. You can it's there. It's Biden's voice. It's the disjunctures of Joe Biden's cognitive process are all present on the Wall Street Journal piece. That it had the wrong premise from the start. Quote, for much of his career, Biden enjoyed a reputation on Capitol Hill for being a master negotiator and of legislative deals, known for his detailed knowledge of issues and insights into the other side's motivations and needs, and for hitting his stride when the pressure was on. No, absolutely not. Joe Biden has always been known as a glad-handed, backslapping, not that bright
Buffoon.
Delaware. Yeah, I mean, buffoon maybe, but the reason that Barack Obama picked him as his running mate was not because Joe Biden was an incisive, brilliant, deeply studied, knowledgeable person, but because he was an old-fashioned hack politician who had long touted his connections with blue-collar voters in places like Pennsylvania, his birth, the state, the Commonwealth of his birth. And speaking of Jonah Goldberg, Jonah got on the same point that struck me when I read the piece. He has a great piece at the Dispatch that it's not about the mileage with Biden. It's about the wear. It's not how old Biden is. It's that, and he has had health problems and he has struggled with those things and all of that stuff. Joe Biden was never the stunning story that the Wall Street Journal would have told. You're too young, but there was a famous Saturday Night Live skit from the late in the second Reagan term during the Iran-Contra scandal, in which a docile, passive, doddering Ronnie Reagan is meeting with the Girl Scout cookies, selling troop, and he's very this way. Well, thanks. And then get these kids out of here. Okay. And he pulls down the map and he's like, Weinberger, are we getting the arms over there for the hostages? Da, 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 da. And it's funny because, of course, nobody thought that Reagan, the premise of Reagan's accusers was that this slightly fuddled, kindly old man was behind the scenes, the mastermind of this arms for hostages deal. The shocking revelation that the Wall Street Journal would have made would have been that behind closed doors, Joe Biden is super sharp, because what you read in the Time transcript and frankly, what you see every day suggests what we know about Joe Biden is that he's fuddled. He's foggy. he has trouble keeping a thought. He has trouble with a lot of stuff. And Americans know they have Joe Biden's in their lives, whether it's a parent, a grandparent, another relative, a neighbor, a friend, somebody who is old. And what do we always say about them? They have good days and they have bad days. And I bet Joe Biden, like all living people, but particularly like people over the age of 80, has good days and has bad days. And some days he's probably real good, and other days he's probably foggy. And that's the hard truth about all of it. I think Democrats as a proposition of the coverage have made a serious mistake in pushing back so hard on this piece. And Nancy Pelosi and all the, this is not, it's only Republicans, it's all of that stuff. Hey guys, there's nothing in this piece we didn't already know. There's no, whatever the Wall Street Journal said it was, it's not an expose, because what it purports to expose is something that is obvious to even the most casual observer of Joe Biden.
Totally. And coinciding with this, we have the Hunter Biden trial,
Woof.
which got underway this week. And the Post and other outlets all had, curtain raisers on this trial. So the Washington Post piece was, for Hunter Biden, a dramatic day with his brother's widow led to charges. It's one way to put it when you're sleeping with your sister-in-law. And they write that of Hallie Biden, who's Hunter Biden's sister-in-law, Beau Biden's widow. Hallie called Hunter, who also came to the store to talk to police, the gun store, saying he'd kept the gun in the truck to avoid bringing it in Hallie's house because of her children. Court documents show Hunter Biden wondered aloud whether store workers might have taken the gun from the trash can, pointing to two Latino men in the upscale supermarket wearing the supermarket shirts and saying, yeah, probably illegal. The police officer asked whether Hunter had told anyone about the incident, including his father. And he said, I have never called my dad for anything, he replied, according to the police report. I've always handled my own affairs. The officer asked whether he was using drugs, floating that as a reason that Hallie was searching his truck. Listen, it isn't like that, Hunter responded, according to the report. I think she believes I was going to kill myself. He told the officer that he was living a nightmare, that he had fallen in love with his brother's widow, and that he was depressed but in love. Oh, my God. One thing that struck me about the news coverage of all of this is that it's less of it's 50% about Joe Biden and how Joe Biden, the New York Times had a piece like, as Hunter Biden's trial approaches, Joe Biden brings his son close. And it featured a picture of Joe Biden biking with Hunter Biden last weekend ahead of the trial. And Politico had a piece about the psychological torture this all is for Biden, having his son on trial, and how close he is with his son. And Biden is obviously, in all the comments that the White House is putting out there, all the leaks coming from the White House about how this is impacting Biden, going for a sympathy play about how hard this is on him.
And Joe Biden went to the trial.
Exactly. So what's interesting to me is that it's never portrayed in the press as a political move, because the political calculation for the White House is that that's the right move for him to do. And there may be truth to it. Like, Biden is obviously close to his son, but there's also political calculation involved. And in the same way that when Donald Trump decides to handle his trial by saying, I'm a victim, and I'm, his responses to the trial that I'm under siege and it's rigged, Biden's responses to the prosecution of his son are like filtered through the same sorts of political calculation, but the press does not cover them as such. And I think that that's a miss.
Well, I certainly take your point, but I do want to credit the proportionality or relative proportionality of coverage of the Hunter Biden case compared to the Trump trial. Obviously, it's 1,000 to 1 Trump coverage to Hunter Biden coverage. But I have to admit, the cynic in me wondered, how are the networks and how are the legacy publication is going to cover the Hunter Biden trial. And they covered it. They're on it. And it definitely does not feel like they're hiding the story. And I agree with you. There are certainly differences in how it's being covered. But I think the fact that it's being covered to the degree that it is speaks well of some sense of fair play. And I think that's to their credit. What keeps striking me, and I know this isn't the news about the news, but rather the news, but I can't escape the contemptible behavior of Hunter Biden, not in what he did as a crack addict, not what he did to seduce his widowed sister-in-law, not what he did, not all of the things that he did in those times, but what he's doing now. And the fact that as his father is running for re-election, and that the best thing that Joe Biden has going for him is the fact that Donald Trump is a lout, right? Donald Trump's loutishness is the best thing Joe Biden's got going for him in winning re-election. And that Hunter Biden couldn't find it within himself to take a plea on these charges long ago. And the fact that Hunter Biden is not already done serving a brief sentence for crimes that he obviously committed, the tax crimes that he is accused of committing, and this gun charge. Well, he obviously did, right? It's not the presumption, the presumption of innocence here for the jury, much like Trump, actually. They're not even saying that he didn't do it. They're saying that the law should be nullified, that it's not really a law, it's an unconstitutional law, or they're saying he was in addiction, but he didn't know that he was in addiction. So it goes to a state of mind.
Right.
And all of that, why he did not plead guilty to one of these charges and be accountable and save his family and the party that he is supposed to be a proud supporter of, why he did not find his way to spend a Martha Stewart length or probably shorter period of time in a safe correctional facility, federal correction facility, I do not know. And the sickness of this, and I think on the sympathy part of it, a lot of Americans can relate, much as they can relate to having a foggy elderly relative like Joe Biden. They can also relate to having a member of a family that is just a wrecking ball, right? Just absolutely laying waste to the family and its fortunes. And here is Hunter Biden. And he says, I'm not going to say he says he's sober. I believe him when he says that he's sober. But the wreckage continues. And he's got a lawyer who is this attack dog. And they went to the Capitol and they did all this stuff. And it's so selfish.
You're talking about Abby Lowell.
Yeah, it's so selfish. It's so yucky. It's so unloving that look, if I have been blessed with very kind, emotionally available children. And I cannot imagine the pain of a parent thinking about a child going to prison for even a crime that they committed. I cannot imagine. But land of Goshen, it's, better to take the Pashto version of, do you know what the Pashto version of a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush is? It is better one beating today than two beatings tomorrow. And for Hunter Biden, it would have been a lot better to get the beating out of the way.
All right, I have a couple thoughts on that. And again, we're away from the news about the news and just talking about the news, which is fine. But Hunter is one actor in this, but there are other actors and actors who have not more responsibility in these acts, but more responsibility on the world stage right now. And I have to think, and everything Biden has said publicly indicates as much, that his father supports his approach to this. And Biden could, it is an option for him, pardon his son right now, and he could pardon Trump. That is an option. And it's one that I've heard people float. And he could have done it a long time ago and put this stuff to the side, put both of these issues to the side. So I don't think Hunter bears all the responsibility. He's obviously a POS and a horrible person, but I think so is his father. So is the father, who I think supports. I think he's a total garbage, dishonest person who has said repeatedly, my son did nothing wrong, when his son obviously did things wrong. His father's the president of the United States. He's saying things that are not true. It's not an excuse when you're the president of the United States. It's not an excuse that, oh, it's my kid. And he has ways out of it too. I think like Biden should not be let off the hook in this.
Biden, but you don't think Biden should pardon his son right now?
I would have no issue if Biden were to pardon Hunter Biden and pardon Trump and say, I'm gonna end both these things.
My son lied on a gun application, and I'm going to pardon him during his trial. And I the reason neither of these people are good candidates for pardons is that neither of them admit that they did what they obviously did. Both of these people, in an empirical, in a detached way. Donald Trump tried to subvert the results of the 2020 election. He says he didn't. He says he was right to do it. He shows no remorse. Hunter Biden was a crack addict who lied on a federal gun form to get a gun, and he shows no remorse. He attacks the law itself. I think both of them are very bad candidates for a pardon. I expect if Joe Biden... Go ahead.
No. If Biden were really going to do the right thing, he would do both of those things and he would resign. I mean, he shouldn't be running for re-election either. And Trump
shouldn't be running for president. If we're getting into where everybody's doing the right thing.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah. It's true on the January 6th thing, but on the other charges, he is like, he says, I did do it. He just doesn't think that they should be crimes. The NDA thing, and he has a point on the Stormy Daniels stuff.
Biden can't pardon him on the hush money charges, but he could pardon him on the documents, and he could pardon him on January 6th.
Right.
But I would guess.
And yeah, we're getting far afield, but I do think Biden bears some responsibility for his son's behavior because he has been totally publicly supportive, and we have no indication from reporting about Biden's stance that he's upset at the approach his son is taking or has tried to.
Classic enabler behavior. Classic.
Yeah, press him to take a plea deal.
The classic codependent enabling behavior from the president, and he's gotten a lot of grief for it. But I would guess, here would be my guess, Hunter Biden will get pardoned. The question is, when? If his dad loses re-election, I would imagine that Joe Biden will pardon his son in the lame duck period. If Joe Biden wins, does he do it right away? Does he wait? How long does he wait to do it, assuming Hunter Biden gets convicted? On the Trump piece of it, if Biden wins, right, then you get to an interesting question about what to pardon Donald Trump for and when to pardon him and how to do it. And if you can, if Trump loses, does he get to some point where he can get ready to make a plea on the other stuff and then Biden can pardon him after that? That would be an interesting conversation that would take place about whether, because it would be the right thing for the country for Biden to say, okay, I won re-election. It's over. Trump's over. Now I can pardon him to show some magnanimity here. But that would be a very interesting thing to watch play out.
Especially if he's going to pardon his son.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There you need to put him in a brace, right? There you're like, if you're gonna pardon your son, you need to do something. You need a little more. You need to balance that out a little bit.
Okay. Moving to Trump, the Wall Street Journal has a piece sort of behind the scenes on the Stormy Daniels trial, and the headline is "How a Mysterious Tip Led to a Trump Conviction." Do you want to talk about this one a little bit?
Yeah, it was interesting. The Wall Street Journal decked both in the past week, both the major party nominees, the piece on Biden's age and infirmity, and then the piece where, and it was a I won't say mincing, but they tiptoed up to the story and said, by the way, just so you all remember where Donald Trump's criminal convictions arose. They arose from us, says the Wall Street Journal. And the tip that somebody gave the Wall Street Journal about these hush money payments, which was what got the ball rolling in the first place. And it was very interesting. And for me, as a journalist, to go back and think through, oh, wow, okay. And I'm sure you've had these experiences. I mean, mine have been on a much smaller scale than these, but you get a tip, you get the thing. And at the time you get it, you maybe don't understand the significance, you don't understand the import and the twists and turns that the story takes. And it was very interesting for me, for the journal, and good on the Journal for claiming their place in this story and taking some ownership of their place in the story. And by the way, whoever leaked this to the Journal chose wisely, because if they would have leaked this to the Washington Post, I bet Donald Trump never would have been convicted. If they would have taken, if this story would have showed up in CNN.com or at the Washington Post, I don't think it would have had the legs. But the Journal, which of course has a conservative editorial page, is owned by the Murdochs and is one of America's very, very two best newspapers in terms of its reporting and its coverage. That that started there probably was the sowed the seed of destruction for Trump, because it came from a different place than the usual suspects on breathless Trump scandal coverage.
All right, should we talk about Trump's interview with Fox and Friends?
Oh, I love it because my refrain about the worst interviews, most damaging interviews are friendly interviews. And so Trump post-trial is doing some interviews, and he did Fox and Friends, and he did what is the Mega MAGA one, News Max. And so he's doing some interviews with friendly outlets to get things back on course and sort of launch the general election campaign in earnest. And so he's doing this interview with the hosts of Fox and Friends, and he's like, "Well, I never said lock her up. I never said that about Hillary Clinton."
You famously said regarding Hillary Clinton, lock her up. You declined to do that as president.
I beat her. It's easier when you win. And they all said lock her up. And I felt, and I could have done it, but I felt it would have been a terrible thing. And then this happened to me. And so I may feel differently about it. I can't tell you, I'm not sure I can answer the question. Hillary Clinton, I didn't say lock her up, but the people would all say lock her up, lock her up. Okay.
And of course, if he were doing an interview with NBC News or CBS or whatever, the interviewer would have said, "No, you did. I'm very certain that you did." And Trump would have been on the defensive and might not have even said it, or would have then explained it away in real time. But he says it to Fox and Friends, and it's like, okay, move it. Just like he gets to say it and keep going and keep going and keep going. The most interesting thing to me, though, comes out later, which is they're asking him about whether or not he would release the secret files on, aliens and the JFK assassination, and will you release all the things? Of course, he was president for 4 years and could have released these things when he had the opportunity. Oh yes, he says, I'm going to release it. And the edited version that they aired, and this was caught by the Washington Post, Rachel Campos Duffy says, "Would you declassify the Epstein files?" "Yeah," Trump replied, "Yeah, I would." Next up was a question from host Pete Hegseth. At least in the program that aired, a fuller version of the interview posted on YouTube shows that Trump had more thoughts on Epstein. "I guess I would," Trump continued in the YouTube version. I think that less so, because, you don't want to affect people's lives if it's phony stuff in there, because it's a lot of phony stuff with that whole world. Among those who have been linked to Epstein, of course, is the former president, Donald Trump. No wonder he's cautious about reminding Campos Duffy that, hey, if you declassify things, some people might get the wrong impression. Do you think he would restore that? Do you think that would restore trust? Help restore trust? Campos Duffy asked. "I don't know about Epstein so much as I do the others," Trump responded. There was one area in which he wasn't worried about releasing information: Epstein's death while in custody. Trump also volunteered that he would declassify documents related to the riot at the Capitol on January 6, 2021. So, friendly interview, let him riff, let him be whatever he wants to be, and he manages to be shady about talking about Jeffrey Epstein. So just a note to campaign strategists: friendly interviews will get you in more trouble than adversarial ones.
All right, Chris, we have to talk about the Washington Post, and this is a big one. Shakeup in the leadership ranks with executive editor Sally Buzbee out in a surprise announcement. I think it came like on Sunday night. And the former executive editor of the Wall Street Journal, Matt Murray, stepping in, but just through November. And then the publisher, Will Lewis, who came from News Corp, who's a Brit, is having his friend, Robert Winnett, come in after the November election. But the accounts of what preceded this, they've been portrayed as dueling accounts, one in the New York Times and one from Dylan Byers, but I really think they're not mutually exclusive. So let's talk about those, and then the reaction inside the Washington Post newsroom, which is not happy with the fact that the leadership shakeup reflects a dissatisfaction with the culture inside the paper, and they're not happy that these are white men who are coming in atop their newsroom, which says a lot about people working in at that paper and broadly in American mainstream media today. So, all right. So the New York Times reports that Buzbee, and this is portrayed as one account, that Buzbee clashed with Lewis. So the executive editor of the paper clashed with the new publisher over coverage of a British phone hacking scandal in which Lewis had been involved. And when Ms. Buzbee said the Post, and that Lewis didn't want the Post to write the piece. And when Ms. Buzbee said the Post would publish an article anyway, he said her decision represented a lapse in judgment and abruptly ended the conversation. The interaction rattled Ms. Buzbee, who then consulted with confidants outside the Post about how she should handle the situation. When the judge ruled several days later on May 21st that Mr. Lewis could be added to the case, the Post published an article about the decision. The reason I don't think this is mutually exclusive with Will Lewis, the publisher of the Post, essentially just deciding to demote her and her deciding she didn't want to suffer that humiliation and resigning instead, is that the Times says the interaction over the court ruling was not the primary reason for her resignation. Ms. Buzbee had already been mulling her future at the Post because of a plan by Mr. Lewis to reorganize the newsroom that he laid out to her in April, the People said. Ms. Lewis had offered Ms. Buzbee a job running a new division focused on social media and service journalism. According to the People, she considered that a demotion, and that's funny language because it just is a demotion, since her job as executive editor included overseeing all parts of the news report. So they're not contradictory. One thing happened, and she was also going to be demoted because the paper lost 50% of subscribers and $77 million on her watch, and the product is not good. So I think it was pretty clear that she was not going to continue atop the paper. Do you have thoughts, Chris?
Watching the competing headlines and news alerts on Sally Buzbee's departure / ouster / whatever, and the pain of the pain for the Post and the pain for Lewis. You know, we talked in our most recent, or the 2 weeks ago, we talked about, okay, he's got this plan and he's going to do it, and it's very big. And we've gotten more detail since then about he's bringing in other people from his experience, right? People from the Telegraph, people from from his world, and other Brits to come in and try to get a hold of the Washington Post. And that it's a big gamble, right? We have in both the New York Times and the Washington Post, as we talked about, a big push to get a hold of these newsrooms and improve the product and do all that stuff. And at the Washington Post, it's a wilder and more troubled space because they're behind, and their newsroom seems to be a little more chaotic, even than, maybe not as the Times was at its peak. What's the name of the gal who went from the Times to the Post, who is a social media?
Taylor Lorenz.
Yeah. So you can just follow the Taylor Lorenz migration to see the
Exactly.
what flows downhill. So this is a big move. by Bezos, to get a hold of the Post and get it under control. And then the question is, can you make it stick? And it was not sticking. So you have the Post does the story, and I think they got scooped on it. I apologize for not remembering what the TikTok on this was, but either about to be scooped or scooped on their own executive editor's departure, or whatever Buzbee's title was.
No, they didn't get scooped on it. They had to rush out a statement because it was going to leak. So it leaked through, a press release from the Post because they realized the news was going to leak.
And then to imagine the scenario in which you've got this phone hacking story. The Times obviously taking real delight in the misery of its competitor. So you've got this phone hacking story in which Lewis is involved. And this is obviously the last thing Lewis wants to talk about it. You can just imagine the sort of cinematic moment when Sally Buzbee is like, hey, okay, so we're working up this story and it's kind of about you, but I think we should do it because, full transparency, we should do it. And if you're Lewis, how outraged you would be that you have this person who you have slated for demotion, and this person says, so about your professional humiliation, let's talk about it. Are we going to do a story? And just aside from who's right or who's wrong in this, just the drama of the moment. And it really does feel like it would be I would love to see The Wire treat this moment and the drama at the Washington Post, because it's a lot of drama now. It went from a boring failure to sort of a high stakes drama about, can the Washington Post figure itself out?
Well, speaking of that drama, the response of the newsroom to the new leadership was not exactly celebratory, which frankly, it's so predictable, but I also don't understand. Like, they are bleeding audience and bleeding money, and yet the response to a change in course and new leadership is protest. It's mind-boggling. So Politico's playbook had, an inside that when Will Lewis goes to announce this, it says Carol Leonnig, who's a reporter at the Post, pressed Lewis on how he expects to manage a complex transition amid a presidential election and how the shakeup might affect the Post's family culture. Are you trying to tell us something about how you're not happy with our culture? She asked. No, your culture's great. Keep doing exactly what you're doing. It's right on target.
Have you ever been in one of those kinds of newsroom meetings?
No, I have not been in one where there's a managerial change announced and people are just complaining, and then
it's a real weird vibe, because you have a room full of reporters who make their bread by being difficult, and you want them in their work to be skeptical, and you want them in their work to be suspicious of spin from powerful people. So what do? You bring a bunch of powerful people down to the newsroom, and with the false egalitarianism of the news business, these people who are multimillionaires come down to the newsroom, and it's a real Steve Buscemi greetings fellow kids moment. And they're like, just let's rap about what's going on in this crazy world that we have. And they want to talk about it. And then of course you can just, if we're making the David Chase series, or who did The Wire?
I forget.
Simon. Yes. So if you're doing the David Simon piece, the looks on the faces in the newsroom as this Brit is there to tell them, you failed, you stink, you're bad at this. And here is this veteran seasoned reporter that's like, so you're saying we're bad? Is that what you're saying? You're saying you don't like us? And it's just, I hate it for the people who are involved, because I'm sure this is very wrenching. It's necessary, right? This is something the Post is going to have to go through. But man, oof. Ugh.
So the other part of the confrontation is Ashley Parker, who's not happy that these are all white men. And
did she say that?
Yeah. So Parker at one point addressed Lewis seeking clarity on the shocking structural change, saying that a, quote, cynical interpretation is that Lewis hired, quote, two buddies in Murray and Winnett, according to people who heard the exchange. She then asked Lewis to expand on the process and whether any internal candidates were considered. When you were here before, you talked very movingly about how you care about diversity, and people talk about diversity. But then when push comes to shove, they say, well, I looked around and couldn't find anyone, Parker said. And Lewis granted that it was a fair question and said, I hear you. Okay, so two white men is my words. And then he said, I've got to do better, and you'll see that going forward. Amazing. Amazing.
For people who have never worked in the news business, it sounds crazy that reporters would put these questions to, or that employees would put these questions to the boss in an open setting. But for the journalists, this is what you get. This is what you get. We're the worst. We're very difficult.
So amazing. That brings us to our facile file.
Yes.
Chris, you flagged this long New York Times story. And this is like akin to the Washington Post story on the secret WhatsApp chat of 100 Jewish rich people and talking to Eric Adams to send the cops in at Columbia. The untold story of the network that took down Roe v. Wade, and a long New York Times spread. And they write the story of how an elite strike force of Christian lawyers, activists, and politicians methodically and secretly led the country down a path that defied the will of a majority of Americans who wanted abortion to remain legal has been hidden until now. The ultimate aim of this behind-the-scenes conservative coalition, which powered one of the most significant political resurgences the United States has ever seen, went far beyond the questions of when and if a pregnancy can be legally ended. For them, the fall of Roe was not an end, but a beginning in their effort to make all abortion illegal and, in fact, roll back the sexual revolution.
Just amazing. This effort was about as secret as the St. Louis Cardinals' effort to win the World Series. There was nothing secret about the effort to do this. It was open, naked, transparent almost, that the Federalist Society and the pro-life movement and everybody involved, that they said it out loud. And I think part of the facileness of this is that for 20 years, people said, okay, well, Roe v. Wade is inviolate, right? And it was accepted that Roe v. Wade is inviolate. And even when people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg and other people on the left would say, yeah, well, the decision was kind of dicey, but it would have been better if it worked out a different way. And it's a little specious, but people didn't listen. They were not listening to what was really going on. And when the long sought, openly sought change finally came, there were those who were alarmed about it, who were vindicated, that said they're trying to roll back Roe v. Wade. They're trying to roll back Roe v. Wade. But many people just assumed that somehow the penumbras of the Constitution that were envisioned in Roe v. Wade were just inviolable, that they would just be there forever. And this piece reflects that kind of thinking, that I can't believe anybody really thought this way. Yes, they definitely thought this way, and they worked hard to do it. And the other telling of this story, if from a more sympathetic outlet, would be what? The most successful public policy project since the Civil Rights Act, right? The long march, the decades-long effort from committed activists. And this is a problem that we have often in coverage. You have to be open to the possibility that people believe the things that they're saying, right? So we should be skeptical, and that sometimes people are BSing us to get what they want, and they don't really mean the things that they say. Yes, we should always be skeptical, and that's true. But it may just be that pro-lifers were pro-life. It may just actually be that these people meant the things that they said and intended to do it. And the long march from 1974 to 2022 of this effort If you disagree with it, it's a shadowy effort by secretive people who are trying to destroy a popular thing. If you agree with them, it's a courageous crusade to right a terrible wrong. And that's so when we write things, when we think about things, we should be open to the possibility that the people who we're covering believe the things that they say.
Okay.
But now,
Oh my gosh.
But
Chris,
now-
I think I saw this next one like 5 minutes when we wrapped our last episode. The New York Times had a piece. What is queer food? A
Yes.
conference explores and tastes some answers. At Boston University, scholars, students, and writers gathered to share thoughts on the role of gender and sexuality in the food space.
yes.
Snacks were plentiful. When Sasha
Happy Pride
DeBose
Month.
uses
I
the
just want to
word
say Happy
queer,
Pride Month.
yeah,
Happy Pride Month,
to talk
Eliana.
about food, it's a verb, not an adjective. To Miss DeBose, queering food is taking how we define food and how we engage with it and twisting it, making it more fun. To them, queer food is also okra. I'm really shocked this person goes by them. The way you slice into okra and it's crunchy and ooshy-gooshy, a lot of people think it's weird, said Miss DeBose, a non-binary transgender lesbian
Yes.
who will soon graduate from the food studies program at New York University. But okra is queer. Queer food can be so many things depending on who's cooking, eating, or serving. During the inaugural Queer Food Conference at Boston University last weekend, queer food was defined as meals made by queer chefs and home cooks. But it was also far broader, almost without boundaries. It was the pie thrown in the face of the anti-gay rights activist Anita Bryant, the gastro-narratives of queer people in El Paso, Texas, and the food served at topless lesbian gatherings, as one panelist described it.
And it wasn't the only queer food event in town. On Sunday night, some of the conference goers made their way over to the High Street Place Food Hall in downtown Boston to sample gay clam chowder and sapphic sticky ribs from LGBTQ chefs, including Tiffany Faison and Kareem Quimet at the Big Queer Food Fest, a culinary event that coincided with the conference. David Lewis, who founded the traveling festival with Chad Hani, said it was a chance to experience queer food as a way of eating and cooking and being together. Just amazing. It should go without saying that okra is not queer. Okra is okra. If a queer person produces okra, it is part of their queer experience, no doubt. But the okra itself is just okra. And the celebrating a affinity or a lifestyle or a way of being or whatever is great, right? And you could also have a food festival for people who are redheaded, or you could also have a food festival for people who are left-handed or who like comic books, or lots of stuff that you could do. But this is just I kept waiting for, and I had higher hopes for this because of the great New York Times piece about the lesbian and bisexual backgammon club. At no point in this piece does anybody wink. At no point in this piece does anybody say, we're being a little silly, we're having a little fun with this here. The crushing earnestness of this it just sucks all of the air out of the room. It is I can think of no better way to celebrate Pride Month than with this piece on queer okra.
It's amazing. Finally, in our follow-up file, Chris, we learned that the Super Size Me documentary director and your fellow West Virginia native Morgan Spurlock passed away at 53, the Washington Post reported, and the cause was cancer. And Mr. Spurlock produced nearly 70 documentaries for film and television, although I have to say the only one I was really familiar with was Super Size Me.
Yeah, and it's a sad story. I pointed to it, because we had talked about how McDonald's 3 weeks ago, I think, we talked about how McDonald's had won the war on McDonald's by appealing to the lovers and not arguing with Spurlock and the haters. And it's a very sad, and Spurlock also subsequently revealed his struggles with alcohol and allegations of sexual assault and harassment, and the troubled life that he had. And what a painful moment that the last big story about your career before your death is how you lost. And it's my heart really went out for him and his family. I mean, he was wrong. There's no question. He was totally wrong in the premise that he followed. But what a tough moment in life to basically on your deathbed have the New York Times come out and say, you lose. And that's a rough chapter.
Chris, that brings us to our obsessions of the week, where we break down these stories that we can't get out of our heads. And mine is also a follow-up file. And it is a few follow-ups on the Alito and Flaggate.
Amazing.
Yes. So the Washington Post has a follow-up. They write, Alito's account of the upside down flag doesn't fully add up. Here's why. Alito has yet to fully explain some key aspects of the controversy. How long did an upside down American flag fly at the Alito's Virginia home? I actually think we know that. It was for 5 or 6 days, a few days, less than a week. Where did they get the appeal to heaven flag that flew at their New Jersey beach house? And more. And then they take issue with that Alito said in an initial comment to the Times that the upside down flag flew briefly. Alito later told Shannon Bream it flew for a short time. In his most recent account and letters to members of Congress, Alito said he requested his wife take down the flag as soon as he saw it, but she refused for several days. Alito did not detail exactly when he saw the flag was up. Some neighbors of the Alitos said they recalled seeing the flag flying for between 2 and 5 days. Okay. So I'm sure this will all be put to rest once he nails down whether it flew for 3 days or 5 days.
And this, of course, is part of the Post doing cleanup on the fact that they got scooped on the story, and the Times shamed them for having the story and sitting on it for years until the time. So the Post has to come out subsequent to the Times article and say, well, we actually had this story. We actually did have this story. So now the Post will take a backseat to no one in flag anxiety.
Totally. The Post came out, and their former Supreme Court reporter, Robert Barnes, who's now retired, said that he had actually been out at the Alito's house in 2021 in January when this happened and spoken to Mrs. Alito about this. And he never wrote the story because, based on his discussions with neighbors and with Mrs. Alito, come to the conclusion that this was her doing, not his, and didn't think it really extended to the Supreme Court justice. He had discussed it with the managing editor at the time, a guy by the name of Cameron Barr, and they had decided not to run the story. And he comes from a more traditional school of journalism and court reporting, not really the ProPublica new Washington Post school. And so they didn't run it, and now they are repenting. They are really repenting. And so Semaphore had a piece on why they didn't run it, and it says, the decision was a matter of, quote, consensus, said Cameron Barr, the former senior managing editor, who said he takes responsibility for the decision not to run the story. The Post's then editor-in-chief, Martin Barron, told Semaphore he had been unaware of the story at the time. I agreed with Supreme Court reporter Bob Barnes and others that we should not do a single slice story about the flag, because it seemed like the story was about Martha Ann Alito and not her husband, recalled Barr of the deliberations. Instead, Barr said he suggested a story on the bitter neighborhood dispute that Alito told them had prompted his wife to raise the flag. They would use the flag itself, he thought, as a detail in the story, but that never took shape. In retrospect, I should have pushed harder for the story, Barr said in a phone interview with Semaphore Sunday. And, that actually makes a lot more sense to me, doing a story on this neighborhood dispute, which is sort of interesting, about Supreme Court justices and their home lives and how they get caught up in these things. And I read a piece this morning about how at the time in 2021, the upside down flag was not perceived when they were talking to these people was not perceived as a January 6th sign, and that the Post reporters who were covering this, like, that was not part of their understanding of what had happened at the time. It is, in retrospect, was superimposed on this by the New York Times. And that was also quite interesting, I thought.
Quite so.
All right, over to you, Chris, to obsess.
Oh, well, mine is a little bit navel-gazy, a little bit. I was overseas when the Trump indictments came down, or the Trump convictions came down, and watching coverage. And, you know, as an American, it is my God-given right to laugh and be amused by the politics of other nations and how adorable I find the British race for control of government, that the election will take place on the 4th of July and all of that stuff. And just look, I know that Americans have a tendency towards smug superiority. I get it, but it is sort of our right. And watching the international coverage, both in Asia and Europe, of what's going on in American politics was a real bummer. And listening to the way that the BBC and other outlets were talking about Trump and hearing it outside of the normal partisan context that we get in the US, right? Where contextualization is happening in real time and watching. And so there is an anti-American bent to a lot of foreign coverage, right? And the BBC is notorious for it. And my favorite, by the way, BBC story that I saw was a story about strawberry self-sufficiency and how Britain, that its season of strawberry self-sufficiency this year would go from May until October, and that this was good news. So in the United States, we're talking about becoming a net exporter of oil and petroleum and energy, and in Britain, they're like, we've made it to October, that we're going to make it to October this year with strawberry self-sufficiency. And of course, it doesn't matter if you're self-sufficient on strawberries, because they grow strawberries in a lot of places. And Europe you can easily get strawberries from the Mediterranean region or wherever brought to you. Britain, it's okay. But watching and then talking to people around the world, and in Singapore, talking to people there, looking with just genuine concern at the fact that the United States has these two people running to be its leader, and the amount of anxiety, not in the sense that they want the United States to lead them and tell them what to do, but look at the United States with genuine concern about our system and genuine concern about our ability to do stuff. And it did hit me. And I felt something that I have never felt as an American abroad before, which was embarrassed. Most of the things that Europeans particularly chide the United States for, SUVs and cowboyism and all that stuff, doesn't embarrass me. I think we're cool. And I also think we don't have to have our washing machines in the kitchen. I think the USA is cool. And a lot of the things that we are tut-tutted for don't bother me in the least, and I think are frequently virtues. But I gotta say, experiencing big events in our political process overseas felt differently. And I just wonder for Americans, and not many of them will, but for those who think about and care a lot about what the status and standing of the United States is in the world, at what point will we care enough to reform these two parties to produce results that we can be more proud of, and that we can again reclaim our position as I think it was the one BBC presenter who said the United States that holds itself up as a role model to the world on good government, and now has a former president who's been convicted on these counts. And there was a smugness in it and a satisfaction in it that I disliked, but also I thought, yeah, we got to do better. This is not good enough.
Chris, that brings us to my favorite time of the week, which is reader mail. And we have a note from David Burghardt in, is it Lucan, Ontario? Not sure how to pronounce that, but
I'll buy
okay.
that.
And David writes, it isn't very often that Canada leads the way in journalism, or anything for that matter, so I was quite surprised to hear you discuss George Skelton's recent epiphany about enacting laws requiring platforms like Google or Facebook to pay news outlets for sharing their products. Pull up an ice block and let me tell you about the great success that has been here in the Great White North. When the same was tried here, Google and Facebook told the Canadian government to go pound snow, indicating they would not pay and instead opt for not allowing the sharing of Canadian news on their platform. That's right. No Canadian-generated news on Google or Facebook. So problem solved, you say? Well, here north of the 49th parallel, we have snowshoed a few steps further. You might call it a journalism double-double. Now Canadian taxpayer dollars are actually handed out to traditional news organizations to offset their declining revenues, free-flowing like February maple sap or Timbits at the arena. Imagine our comfort knowing that when turning on the CBC or picking up the Toronto Star, journalists' salaries bypass the pesky free market economy and go directly from our frozen pockets to theirs. No need to be concerned if corporate or advertiser pressure influences their coverage, because that has been replaced by our wise and ethical government led by the freedom-loving Justin Trudeau. Aren't we blessed? Thank you so much for the podcast. I look forward to it each week, and thank you for saving the Sunday morning show, Chris. Congratulations on your forthcoming nuptials. All the best.
Oh, what? And I must say that the layered Canadian jokes are
great.
Just mwah, perfect. Thank you, Mr. Burghardt.
And we have another note from Colin in Liberty City, Texas. And he writes, Dear Chris and Eliana, first off, I love the show and look forward to listening to it every Friday. It's so refreshing to hear a reasonable perspective on what's going on in the American news media. I'm a longtime member of the Dispatch and stumbled upon your wonderful podcast due to Chris's excellent rank punditry with Jonah Goldberg. Now I get to enjoy both of your perspectives on a range of stories. It's a wonderful blend of banter and serious discussion. This headline popped up this afternoon, Tuesday, May 28th. I'm sure you've already seen it, and I can already hear Stirewalt's voice as he talks about the once again impending doom of the honeybees. The hornet has landed. Scientists combat new honeybee killer in U.S. Okay?
Just when you thought they were safe, just when you thought that the pollinators were safe, the murder, a new murder hornet, the double murder hornet has arrived.
And
Fabulous.
it's an invasive yellow-legged wasp has been decimating beehives in Europe and bedeviling Georgia since last summer. Researchers are working nest by nest to limit the threat while developing better eradication methods.
Well, be alert. Be alert. The hornet has landed. Here we go. And by the way, I've seen invasive yellow-legged wasps at a lot of beaches in Europe too, so be careful.
And he says, thank you for making my Fridays a little brighter. That brings us to, Chris, your favorite time of the week. When I am forced to say something nice, and I have a great one this week, but you first.
I love the piece that the New York Times did on John Curtis, who is the venerable figure of UK elections. And he is a professor of political science at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. And he is the exit polling guru of Britain. And of course, British elections are much more challenging than it's a small country, relatively speaking, but it's more challenging because you're doing math and forecasts in many, many races. It would be, in the obvious comparison, if you were trying to forecast the US presidential election, and by the way, this is how we should do our presidential elections, and the Madison plan is electors based on congressional district instead of statewide, I think would be a lot better. But we have 50 states in the District of Columbia in which to make forecasts. They have to make forecasts in individual, sometimes very small parliamentary districts, and then figure out what that's going to add up on the national. And it's tricky and it's all that stuff. And it's a great profile of John Curtis, who has stayed nonpartisan, has stayed, he loves the work for itself, and has remained a trusted figure. It's a lovely profile, really, really good.
All right, Chris, mine is not that serious, but nothing has given me more joy over the past couple of weeks than my favorite influencer, Bethany Frankel. She was in Chicago and she got into a big feud with Chanel because she was just wearing jeans and a t-shirt and didn't look like the rich lady she is. And she went up to the door of a Chanel store and wanted to go in. And they were like, "Excuse me, do you have an appointment?" And they wouldn't let her in the store. And she did the most amazing Instagram video about it. So let's play that.
So I'm in Chicago, and the man at the Chanel store opens the door like this much. Like Ratatouille couldn't fit in there. And he's like, "Hello? Do you have an appointment?" Like, he's like Lurch in the Addams Family. Like, "You rang?" And I'm already on the offensive, and I'm like, "No, I don't have an appointment. I have a credit card, I have a bag of carrots, popcorn, a basic purse. Am I not allowed to come in at 3:54 on a Tuesday?" Evidently not. I don't have an appointment. And to be like treated like you're an interloper. Like, I'm just walking down the street, just opening up a door to just walk into a store. I thought that's what happened. Like, I didn't realize that we're not allowed to walk into stores anymore. I don't have an appointment. Got to get a pap smear appointment and also to go walk in Chanel. No big deal.
All right. So she does this hilarious rant, and then she's done like 10 follow-up videos about Chanel. Okay, then she went back the next day and dressed like a rich person, and they did not say, "Oh, sorry, do you need an appointment?" And they just let her in the store. And so since then, she's done all these rants about Chanel. You got to go check out her page and all of her Chanel rant videos, sticking it to them. It is hilarious. It brought me
kind of your spirit animal.
Totally. It brought me so much joy. Well, that is all the time we have for the news about the news. If you have a story you want us to talk about, email us at wretches@nebulouspodcasts.com. and sign up for our newsletter at nebulouspodcasts.com. This has been Ink Stained Wretches from Nebulous Media, produced by Colin Chicola. Find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Wretches.